In November of 1948, an international tribunal in Tokyo sentenced 7 men to hang for Japan's war and handed life imprisonment to 16 more. The one man in whose name every order in that war had been issued was never charged, never indicted, never called as a witness, and never questioned under oath about any of it. That man was Emperor Hirohito, and this is the account of the evidence that survives, the evidence that was deliberately burned, and the reason historians have argued over the answer for more than 75 years without arriving at one. Start with a number, because the number is where the argument gets its teeth. Between August and October of 1938, during the Battle of Wuhan, Imperial General Headquarters authorized the use of toxic gas against Chinese forces on 375 separate occasions. That figure belongs to the research of Yoshiaki Yoshimi and Seiya Matsuno, published in 1997 in a collection of materials on Japanese poison gas warfare. Those orders moved through Imperial General Headquarters, and Imperial General Headquarters had exactly one person sitting at the top of it. Hold that number, because the argument about Emperor Hirohito is not really an argument about whether events like this occurred. Documentation on Wuhan is not seriously disputed by anyone. What gets disputed is what a signature meant inside a system engineered so that no single signature would ever mean very much. A second document sits at the center of this story, and it points in the opposite direction entirely. On the 27th of September, 1945, Emperor Hirohito traveled to the American Embassy in Tokyo to meet General Douglas MacArthur, and the photograph taken that day became one of the defining images of the 20th century. According to MacArthur, the emperor said this, that he came to offer himself to the judgment of the powers MacArthur represented, as the one to bear sole responsibility for every political and military decision made and every action taken by his people in the conduct of the war. Read as written, that is a total acceptance of guilt. It also appears in exactly one place, which is MacArthur's memoir, Reminiscences, published in 1964, 19 years after the meeting occurred. 3 people occupied that room, the emperor, the general, and the interpreter Katsuzo Okamura, and all 3 agreed to keep the contents confidential. When the Imperial Household Agency published its own official annals of Hirohito's life in 2014, running to 61 volumes drawn from more than 3,000 primary sources, the account of that meeting carried no offer to take responsibility at all. So the shape of the problem comes into focus. On one side, 375 documented authorizations. On the other, a confession that may never have been spoken aloud. Sitting between them, a constitutional structure built to make the question unanswerable, and a fire that burned through 3 weeks of August 1945 and consumed the records that might have settled it. What follows is what can actually be established, what stays genuinely contested, and why the most serious historians who have spent their careers inside these documents still cannot agree. Understanding the argument about Emperor Hirohito requires understanding the constitution he inherited, because that document was no accident of drafting. Every ambiguity in it was placed there on purpose. Promulgated on the 11th of February, 1889, and taking effect on the 29th of November, 1890, the Meiji Constitution governed Japan until its abrogation in 1947. 4 of its articles carry the weight here. Article 3 declares the emperor sacred and inviolable. Article 4 names the emperor head of the empire, combining in himself the rights of sovereignty and exercising them according to the provisions of the Constitution. Article 11 grants the emperor supreme command of the army and navy, which in Japanese is the Taswiken, the right of supreme command. Article 13 gives the emperor the power to declare war, make peace, and conclude treaties. Taken plainly, those 4 articles describe an absolute monarch. Sovereignty, supreme military command, and the war power all pool in one person who has simultaneously been placed beyond legal challenge. On paper, the Showa emperor ranked as the most constitutionally powerful head of state anywhere in the industrialist world. The Meiji system, though, carried a structural feature that inverted this almost completely, and grasping it is the single most useful thing anyone can do before forming a view on the whole affair. Japanese constitutional practice called it the independence of the supreme command, the Toswikan no Dokuritsu. It held that military command matters, gunrei, stood constitutionally apart from the general affairs of state, kikumu. Military matters went directly to the emperor from the service chiefs of staff, through a practice called iakujoso, bypassing the cabinet and bypassing the diet entirely. Consider what that arrangement produces. Cabinet ministers could not command the military. The legislature could not command the military. One node in the entire structure sat above both the civil government and the armed forces, and that node was the throne. Anyone who has worked inside a large organization will recognize this immediately. What the Meiji drafters built is a reporting structure in which two powerful divisions bypass the executive layer and report straight to a single figure at the top, a figure holding formal authority, but no independent staff, no independent intelligence, and no operational capacity to act on any of what gets reported. Modern corporate governance has a name for the condition that results, and the name is an accountability sink. Everything flows through the position, so the position absorbs blame perfectly, while retaining almost no ability to redirect what flows through it. None of that was a drafting error. Japan's Meiji oligarchs built a throne that legitimized everything and initiated nothing, which produces the central interpretive fault line of this whole subject, and stating it precisely matters, because nearly every disagreement between historians reduces down to this one split. Either Emperor Hirohito ranked as a constitutional monarch, bound by an ironclad convention that he reign and never rule, ratifying decisions already settled below him by men he could not overrule without wrecking the institution itself. Or the Showa emperor operated as an active sovereign who wielded the enormous formal powers granted by Articles 4 and 11, working through a system whose deliberate ambiguity handed him permanent deniability. Those are not two descriptions of one man. They describe two different men, and as this account will show, the documentary record supports both readings in different places. Now the machinery itself. Imperial General Headquarters, the Daihani, was re-established in November of 1937 for the war with China, serving as the supreme organ that coordinated the Army and Navy high commands, and it operated under the Emperor as Commander-in-Chief. Every order carrying the highest authority in the Japanese war effort passed through that body. Formally above it sat the Imperial Conferences, known in Japanese as Guzenkaigi, which translates roughly as conferences in the honorable presence. Cabinet ministers and military leadership gathered at these meetings, held in the emperor's presence, to sanction the highest decisions of state. Protocol at those conferences becomes critical here. Convention held that the emperor said nothing at all. Seated in silence, he did not debate, did not question, and did not object, while the president of the Privy Council posed questions on his behalf and functioned as his proxy voice in the room. Through the late 1930s and into the war, Yoshimichi Hara held that office. Actual policy never got made at these conferences. Substance had already been hammered out beforehand at liaison conferences, meetings between the cabinet and the high command, so that by the time any matter reached the Imperial Conference, agreement was settled and the outcome was known. Which means that when Emperor Hirohito broke that silence, it registered as a rupture in protocol so unusual that participants recorded it, remembered it, and argued about its meaning for the rest of their lives. Across 19 years, he broke it a handful of times. Every one of those occasions has since become a battlefield in the historiography, and every one of them appears later in this account. A small circle of men stood around the throne, mediating almost everything the emperor knew. Most important among their offices was the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, the Naidaijin, who served as the emperor's closest political advisor. Nobuaki Makino held that post earlier in the reign, and from the 1st of June, 1940, until the 24th of November, 1945, it belonged to Koichi Kido. Kido kept a diary running from 1930 to 1945 containing over 6,000 entries, and that diary would later become the single most important body of prosecution evidence at the Tokyo trial. Kinmochi Saionji, the last surviving Genro or elder statesman, advised on the selection of prime ministers until his death in 1940. There was also the chief aide-de-camp and the Imperial Household Ministry, known today as the Imperial Household Agency, which controlled access, records, and the presentation of the throne to the public. Division ran through the court itself, separating the Naitai, the inner court of the private imperial household, from the outer court of the formal state apparatus. Historians call the opacity this produced the chrysanthemum curtain, and very little crossed it in either direction without passing through the hands of the men just named. One further piece of context belongs here, because it establishes that the constitutional question was live inside Japan at the time rather than being a post-war invention. Through the 1920s, the mainstream academic interpretation of the Meiji Constitution belonged to Tatsukichi Minobe of Tokyo Imperial University, and his position carried the name organ theory, the Tenno Kikensetsu. Minobe argued that sovereignty resided in the state, and that the emperor functioned as an organ of that state, exercising its powers rather than personally owning them. His rival, Shinkichi Usugi, insisted on the reverse, absolute personal sovereignty vested in the emperor himself. For roughly 15 years, Minobe's reading stood as the standard one taught in Japanese universities. In 1935, it was destroyed. A nationalist campaign drove the organ theory out of public life. Minobe's books were banned, and Minobe himself resigned his seat in the House of Peers. That suppression tells us something worth holding on to. Whether the emperor personally ruled was never a settled matter of Japanese constitutional understanding. Leading scholars contested it publicly, and the contest got resolved in 1935 not through argument, but through political force, in favor of the reading that made the emperor an absolute personal sovereign. 6 years before Pearl Harbor, Japan had officially adopted the position that the throne was not merely symbolic. Hirohito was born on the 29th of April, 1901, and given the childhood name Prince Michi. Narrow and deliberately shaped, his education began with ethics taught by Shigetake Sugiura, a nationalist thinker working inside a Confucian frame. During his youth at the Gakushuin, the Peers School, the future emperor came under the mentorship of General Mersuk Nogi, a soldier who had become a national symbol of martial self-sacrifice. Traditionalist, duty-centered, and weighted heavily toward the military, the curriculum that produced the Showa emperor left very little room for anything else. At the age of 20, in 1921, Hirohito toured Europe as the first Japanese crown prince ever to travel abroad. On the 25th of November that same year, he became regent, Sessho, taking on the functions of the throne while his father, the Taisho emperor, lay incapacitated. Accession followed on the 25th of December, 1926, opening the Showa era, and the formal enthronement ceremony came on the 10th of November, 1928. There is a detail about Emperor Hirohito that nearly every account mentions and almost none develops, and it bears directly on how the man thought. The Showa emperor worked as a scientist, not as a dilettante, but as a serious taxonomist specializing in hydrozoa, the class of aquatic animals that includes hydroids and certain jellyfish, and in slime molds as well. Guidance came from the biologist Hirotaro Hattori, and a laboratory was built for him at Akasaka in 1925. His first scientific discovery, an unknown species of prawn, arrived in 1919 when he was 18 years old. Across his life, he authored numerous works, among them The Hydroids of Sagami Bay in 1988, with a second volume published after his death in 1995, and he named new species along the way. Specimens he personally collected in Sagami Bay during the 1930s turned up decades later sitting in the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences, and became the subject of a 2014 paper by the researcher Yves Salmon in Archives of Natural History. A bust of Charles Darwin stood in his library, alongside busts of Lincoln and Napoleon. Now consider what taxonomy trains a mind to do. Taxonomy is the discipline of observing without intervening, and the taxonomist's entire method rests on patient, meticulous, non-participatory classification. You watch the organism, you record what it does, and you never alter its behavior, because altering it destroys the value of the observation. Imagining a training more precisely suited to a man whose constitutional role required him to sit silently in a room while other men decided the fate of an empire, and then to sanction whatever those men had decided, is genuinely difficult. The British botanist E.J. H. Corner, who knew him, compressed the whole thing into 5 words, saying that Hirohito wore 2 faces. Now the first real test, and the first genuinely hard piece of evidence in the responsibility argument. At roughly 23 minutes past 5 on the morning of the 4th of June, 1928, the Chinese warlord Zhang Zuolin was assassinated at Huangatan, near Mukden. Officers of Japan's Guangdong Army, the force garrisoning Japanese interests in Manchuria, planted the bomb, and the chief plotter was Colonel Daisaku Komodo. Zhang's death went unannounced publicly until the 25th of June, and inside Japan the affair carried only a euphemism, a certain important incident in Manchuria. What had actually happened was that the Japanese army had murdered the head of a foreign regional government without authorization from Tokyo. Prime Minister Jichi Tanaka indicated at first that the officers responsible would face punishment, and then, under pressure from the army, Tanaka reversed himself. Emperor Hirohito, then 28 years old and not yet formally enthroned, expressed his displeasure directly. On the 2nd of July, 1929, the Tanaka cabinet resigned en masse, and Tanaka himself died on the 29th of September that year. That episode is the hinge on which one of the 2 major interpretations of Hirohito's entire reign turns, and the reason deserves stating precisely. A young emperor, barely 2 years into his reign, registered personal displeasure with the prime minister, and the government of Japan fell. No Diet vote brought it down. No coalition collapsed. The throne was displeased, and that proved sufficient. Whatever the Constitution said about reigning rather than ruling, the practical demonstration in July of 1929 was that the Showa emperor possessed the capacity to end a government. Hirohito's own later account of that moment, given in 1946, characterized the intervention as youthful impulsiveness, a mistake of inexperience he resolved never to repeat, precisely because it had shown him the dangers of a throne acting politically. Herbert Bix regards that framing as a self-serving rationalization built after the fact, in the specific context of an approaching war crimes tribunal. Both readings fit the same facts, and that pattern is going to recur. Between 1931 and 1937, the Japanese army repeatedly took actions Tokyo had never authorized, and the throne repeatedly ratified them afterward. That sequence forms the core of the case against Emperor Hirohito, and read from the other direction, the core of the case for his powerlessness. On the 18th of September, 1931, officers of the Guangdong Army staged an explosion on the South Manchuria Railway near Mukden and used it as pretext for military operations. Historians call it the Mukden Incident, and the seizure of Manchuria begins there. What followed was a run of unauthorized expansions. Guangdong Army units pushed into Jilin with no authorization from Tokyo, and later came the bombing of Qinzhou, also known as Jianzhou. According to Herbert Bix, Emperor Hirohito accepted the army's accomplished facts and took part in the cover-up that followed. Notice the contrast with 1929. In the Zhang Zuolin affair, imperial displeasure had brought down a cabinet, and 3 years later, presented with a far larger unauthorized military adventure that would reshape East Asia, the same throne accommodated it. What changed is the obvious question. One answer holds that the emperor learned in 1929 that intervention carried danger and drew the lesson never to repeat it. Another answer holds that he had no objection to the outcome in Manchuria. Documentation on that second point is not conclusive, and this account will not pretend otherwise. Naval officers assassinated Prime Minister Tsuyoshi Inukai on the 15th of May, 1932, in what became known as the May 15th incident, and party cabinet government in Japan effectively ended there. Then comes the event that the constitutional monarch reading has to explain. Between the 26th and the 29th of February, 1936, a faction of young army officers launched a coup in Tokyo, with roughly 1,500 troops seizing central government buildings and moving against the men who ran the country. Their target list included the emperor's own closest advisors. Hirohito's response came immediately, and it came furious. The Showa emperor did not wait for the cabinet, did not defer to the high command, and demanded the rebellion be crushed. An order to suppress went out, delayed by roughly 24 hours by an army leadership reluctant to fire on its own officers and dragging its feet at every stage. and the rebels surrendered on the 29th of February. Here is where the February 26th incident carries its analytical weight, and it cuts in a direction that neither side of the historiographical argument finds entirely comfortable. When the Guangdong army seized Manchuria without authorization, the emperor accommodated it. When the army bombed Qinzhou, the emperor accommodated that too. And when a prime minister was assassinated, the institution absorbed it. When rebel officers moved against his personal advisors, the emperor overrode the army high command, demanded suppression, and got it, against the visible reluctance of the men he was ordering. Capacity, in other words, was demonstrably present. 1929 demonstrated it, 1936 demonstrated it again, and the intervening years show that capacity going unused. Behavioral economics offers a concept worth borrowing here, called revealed preference. Its premise runs that stated preferences are cheap and unreliable, while actual choices made under real constraint reveal what a person genuinely values. You do not learn what someone wants by asking. You learn it by watching what they spend scarce resources on. Apply that framework to the Showa emperor between 1931 and 1936, and the result turns uncomfortable for both camps. Defenders of the constitutional monarch reading run into the obvious problem, which is that the emperor spent his scarce political capital in February of 1936 and got exactly what he demanded, and that is a revealed capacity to act. The prosecution reading hits a subtler difficulty that is no less real. What the emperor spent that capital on was the defense of the institution and the men around it, rather than the direction of foreign policy, the conduct of the war in China, or territorial expansion. Had Hirohito been an aggressive expansionist directing strategy from the throne, the interventions would be expected to cluster around strategic questions, and instead they cluster around threats to the imperial institution itself. Fix accounts for this by arguing that the emperor's overriding motive throughout was precisely the preservation of the throne with himself on it, which renders the pattern consistent rather than exculpatory. None of that settles anything, and settling it is not the point. The point is that identical behavioral data supports a monarch defending an institution and a monarch defending himself, and no document has yet surfaced that separates the two. On the 7th of July, 1937, Japanese and Chinese forces exchanged fire at the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing. Within weeks it had grown into a full war, and 8 years would pass before it ended. November of 1937 brought the re-establishment of Imperial General Headquarters for the war with China, and from that point forward the chain of command running from the front in China to the throne in Tokyo becomes formalized and documented. That matters for what comes next. In December of 1937, Japanese forces took the Chinese capital at Nanjing, and among the officers in field command was Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, the emperor's uncle by marriage and a member of the imperial house. What happened at Nanjing is one of the most bitterly contested statistical questions in modern history, and the divergence itself teaches something useful. Figures cited for deaths in the Nanjing massacre range from 40,000 to more than 340,000. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East and the People's Republic of China both used figures up to and exceeding 300,000, while more recent scholarly estimates commonly land between 100,000 and 200,000. A spread of a factor of 8 is what that amounts to. Dishonesty is not the primary cause of it, and treating it that way is the mistake that has poisoned discussion of this subject for decades. Definitional divergence causes the spread, and 3 axes drive it. Geographic scope comes first. Does the count cover the walled city of Nanjing, or the city plus the surrounding administrative districts where a great deal of the killing also occurred? Those are different areas, and they yield different numbers. Timescale comes second. Does the count cover 6 weeks, or the full period of the campaign approach and occupation? Different windows produce different totals. Category comes third. Does the count include Chinese soldiers killed after surrendering, prisoners of war executed en masse, or only civilians? On that single definitional choice, the number moves by tens of thousands. A researcher can work with complete honesty and arrive at 100,000 or at 300,000 depending on which 3 choices get made at the outset. Serious work on this subject always states its definitions before it states its number, which is why any account offering a single figure without stating the scope deserves caution. Imperial awareness of Nanjing is precisely where the documentary problem bites hardest, and the honest answer is that the surviving record does not resolve it. A member of the imperial family held field command. Imperial General Headquarters had been running for a month. What got reported upward, in what terms, and what was understood by whom, cannot be established from what survives. That phrase, what survives, becomes the central issue of this entire account, and the reason will follow shortly. There is one area, though, where the paper trail did survive, and where it runs specific. Japanese forces fought the Battle of Wuhan between August and October of 1938. According to the research of Yoshiaki Yoshimi and Seiya Matsuno, published in 1997 in Materials on Poison Gas Warfare 2, part of a collection of top-secret materials from the 15-Year War, the use of toxic gas during that battle was authorized on 375 separate occasions. Transmission ran through Imperial General Headquarters by Prince Kodahito Kannon, who served as Army Chief of Staff, or by General Hajime Sugiyama. Prince Narihiko Higashikuni drafted a related notice authorizing gas use on the 16th of August, 1938, a detail that comes from the work of Bob Tadashi Wakabayashi in Sino-Japanese Studies. International context leaves no ambiguity either. On the 14th of May, 1938, the League of Nations passed a resolution condemning Japanese gas use in China. The practice was known, and it was condemned, while it was still being expanded. Two things need saying about the figure of 375, and both matter. The first concerns sourcing. That number is the product of Yoshimi and Matsuno's reading of the surviving orders, and it belongs attributed to their research rather than treated as a freestanding, independently established fact. Historians disagree about a great deal in this field, and honest practice names whose count you are citing. The second point is the more interesting one, and modern institutional compliance illuminates it. Compliance analysts describe a failure mode sometimes called the aggregation problem, and it works like this. An organization designs an approval process in which each individual authorization runs routine, low salience, and requires only a signature at a level that sees the request as one item among hundreds. No single approval feels like a decision, because the person signing is not deliberating, only processing. The aggregate of those approvals nonetheless constitutes a policy that nobody ever formally adopted. Financial compliance failures happen exactly this way. Procurement fraud survives inside large organizations for years through the same mechanism, which is why modern audit practice examines patterns of approval rather than individual approvals. The individual approval is designed to look innocuous, and the pattern is where the intent lives. 375 authorizations is not a decision. It amounts to a policy, running for roughly 3 months through a command structure with the throne at its apex. What that fact cannot tell us on its own is what any individual at the top of that structure understood himself to be authorizing on any given day, and the men who could have answered were, for reasons that come later, never asked. Japan's road to war with the United States runs through 3 imperial conferences and 1 poem. Context arrives first. Japan's war in China had not been won. On the 27th of September, 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, and in 1939 Japanese forces had been badly handled by the Soviets at Namenhen, at Kakenjioel, a defeat that shaped Japanese strategic thinking about which direction to expand. By September of 1941, the question in Tokyo had narrowed to whether to accept American terms or go to war. In September of 1941, Emperor Hirohito questioned General Hajime Sugiyama directly. That exchange survives in the Sugiyama Memo, which is Sugiyama's own record, making it a contemporaneous document rather than a post-war recollection, and that distinction carries enormous weight in this subject. The emperor's question, in one rendering, ran as follows. At the time of the China incident, the army had told him China could be made to surrender in 3 months, and yet years later China still had not been beaten. Sugiyama was named as the minister who had given that assurance. Sugiyama's answer was that China was a vast area with many ways in and out. Wording varies between translations, though the substance faces no serious dispute. The Emperor of Japan, in a private audience, confronted his army chief of staff with the army's own failed forecast, and did it with a pointedness that Sugiyama himself thought worth writing down. That is not the behavior of a man being kept in the dark. Whatever else can be argued about the Showa emperor, the Sugiyama memo establishes that Hirohito tracked the gap between what the army promised and what the army delivered, and was willing to say so to the army's face. On the 6th of September, 1941, an imperial conference convened, and at that conference Emperor Hirohito broke protocol by speaking aloud. What the emperor did was recite a poem written by his grandfather, the Meiji Emperor, in 1904, at the opening of the Russo-Japanese War. One English rendering runs that all the people of the world are brethren. So why are the waves and the wind so unsettled? Another opens with the seas of the four directions, all born of one womb. Translations of the poem diverge considerably, and anyone quoting a single English version as definitive is claiming more than the Japanese supports. The recitation itself is documented thoroughly, appearing across the sources. The Emperor of Japan, in a room where he was expected to say nothing at all, chose to recite his grandfather's verse about the brotherhood of nations at the meeting that set Japan on course for war. What the gesture meant is where the argument begins. The traditional reading, favored by those who see a reluctant monarch, treats it as a coded rebuke. Vetoing the policy outright was impossible without shattering the convention holding the entire system together, and what remained available was signaling, through the most respectable vehicle imaginable, the words of the Meiji Emperor himself, that he wanted the diplomatic path pursued rather than the military one. Read that way, it stands as the strongest available evidence that Hirohito tried to stop the war inside the only vocabulary the system permitted him. The competing reading is less comfortable. It observes that the Meiji Emperor wrote that poem at the opening of the Russo-Japanese War, a war Japan fought and won, and which established the country as a great power. Reciting a poem associated with the successful commencement of a previous war is not self-evidently a plea for peace. Read that way, the gesture is ritual rather than dovish, and its pacifist interpretation becomes a post-war overlay. No document settles this. The recitation is a fact, the intent is an inference, and serious scholars have drawn both inferences from the same evidence. What faces no dispute is the sequence that followed. On the 5th of November, 1941, an imperial conference approved the operations plan. On the 1st of December, 1941, an imperial conference sanctioned war against the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. On the 8th of December, 1941, Japan time, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, and an imperial rescript declaring war went out in the emperor's name. 3 conferences, 3 ratifications, 90 days. Organizational decision-making offers a phenomenon sometimes called the ratification trap, and the 1941 sequence sits close to a textbook case of it. The mechanism works like this. An organization designs a process where substantive deliberation happens at a lower tier, and the final authorities. Role shrinks to formal approval of a fully formed proposal presented at the last stage. Formally, that final authority holds veto power, and practically, exercising it means overturning weeks of consensus building, humiliating everyone who built the proposal, and admitting that the entire process was theater. Studies of corporate board behavior describe the same pattern. Boards technically approve the acquisition, and boards almost never reject the acquisition, not because they agree, but because by the time it reaches them, rejection carries an institutional cost that approval does not. Applied to 1941, that framework generates an awkward conclusion for both sides of the argument. It suggests Emperor Hirohito probably could have refused, and that refusing would have cost him enormously, which is a different claim from saying he was powerless, and a different claim again from saying he wanted war. What the framework cannot tell us is which of those costs he was actually weighing inside the room. Answering that would take the records, and in August of 1945, somebody burned them. By early 1945, the war was lost, and Tokyo understood it to be lost. On the 14th of February, 1945, Prince Fumimaro Kono, a former prime minister who had held office twice before the war, submitted a memorial to the throne urging surrender. Kono's argument was not primarily military. continued fighting, he warned, risked a communist revolution inside Japan, and the imperial institution itself would not survive that. Emperor Hirohito's reply, as reported, was that peace would be difficult to obtain without one more military gain. That reply is the sharpest single sentence in the case against the Showa emperor, and its sharpness comes entirely from what followed it. Between February and August of 1945, the war produced no Japanese military gain. What it produced instead was Okinawa. In the argument advanced by Herbert Bix, the toll of that final phase includes more than 120,000 Japanese combatants and between 150,000 and 170,000 non-combatants killed on Okinawa alone before any surrender arrived. Then came the atomic bombings, and then the Soviet entry into the war. Through June, July, and early August of 1945, Japanese leadership pursued peace by indirect means. Koichi Kido produced a memorandum in June. Overtures went to the Soviet Union, seeking mediation from a power that had already agreed with the Allies to enter the war against Japan. None of it produced a decision, because the Japanese decision-making structure sat deadlocked. The interwar cabinet could not reach the consensus the system required, and without consensus nothing could move upward for sanction. Then the structure did something it had not done across 19 years of the Showa reign. Just before midnight on the 9th of August, 1945, and continuing into the 10th, an imperial conference convened, and Emperor Hirohito broke the deadlock personally. Japanese historiography calls this the first of the two Seiden, the sacred decision, the imperial decision. On the 14th of August, 1945, it happened a second time, and the decision was taken to accept the Potsdam Declaration. Between the 14th and 15th of August, elements of the army attempted a coup to prevent the surrender being announced, in what became known as the Kyujo incident, and it failed. On the 15th of August, 1945, the emperor's recorded voice was broadcast to the Japanese people for the first time in history, and the formal surrender was signed on the 2nd of September. The broadcast itself repays close examination, because what it left out has been argued over ever since. Delivered in a formal classical court register that ordinary Japanese listeners found difficult to follow, the dual voice broadcast, the Gyokuon Hoso, drew on an underlying text, the rescript on the termination of the war, drafted by Hizutsun Sakamizu. Two phrases from it entered history. One states that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The other calls on the population to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. The word surrender, kafuku, appears nowhere in it. A nation that had lost a war involving the deaths of millions learned the outcome in archaic court language, from a voice most of its citizens had never heard, in a text that never contained the word for what had actually happened. English renderings of both phrases vary, because the classical register does not translate cleanly. And now the argument the Seiden generate, which is the single most productive disagreement in this entire field. The first position, associated with Herbert Bix, runs as follows. In August of 1945, Emperor Hirohito personally broke a deadlock the constitutional machinery could not break, twice, and ended the war, which is a demonstration of decisive imperial agency. If that capacity existed in August of 1945, it existed in February of 1945, when Kono presented his memorial and was told Japan needed one more military gain. Read that way, the Seiden do not exonerate the emperor. They convict him of the final year, of Okinawa, of the firebombing campaign, of everything that occurred between the moment the war was clearly lost and the moment he chose to say so. The second position holds that this misreads what the Seiden actually were. On that account, the imperial decisions of August 1945 were not spontaneous exercises of sovereign will but stage-managed events. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and Koichi Kido understood that the Japanese system could not produce a surrender decision through normal consensus because no member of the inner cabinet could survive proposing it. So the deadlock was engineered, deliberately, to create a situation where the emperor could be invited to resolve it, allowing a decision that had already formed among the peace faction to be ratified in a form the army could not refuse without committing open treason against the throne. Read that way, The Seiden were an instrument used by the men around the emperor rather than evidence of unilateral imperial power, which collapses the argument that he could have done the same thing in February, because in February the peace faction had not yet built the position the Seiden was designed to deliver. Serious historians hold both readings. Both stay consistent with the documented sequence of events, and neither has produced a document that eliminates the other. This account will not pretend to adjudicate between them, because the honest position is that the evidence which would adjudicate between them was, in large part, destroyed on purpose. Everything argued about Emperor Hirohito gets argued from an incomplete record, and that incompleteness is no accident of time, damp, or Allied bombing. It was a policy executed under orders during the final weeks of the war. The sequence begins before the surrender had even been decided. On the 7th of August, 1945, the Japanese Foreign Ministry issued its own document destruction order, and approximately 20,000 volumes were destroyed. On the 14th of August, the Army Ministry issued an internal incineration order under the authority of the War Minister, transmitted the following day, the 15th of August, as Army Classified Telegram Number 67. Text of that order survives, through the testimony of Colonel Yozo Miyama, held in the National Archives of Japan. Classified documents were to be incinerated immediately. The telegram itself was to be incinerated upon receipt, by order of the minister. Read that instruction again, because the second sentence carries the weight. An order to destroy the records included an order to destroy the order. The Kempeitai, Japan's military police, issued a parallel instruction on the 14th of August, and its targets ran specific: foreign affairs materials, counterintelligence materials, records of ideological surveillance, and what were described as secret history materials. A follow-up on the 20th of August warned that some documents had only been partially burned and required further attention. Destruction stopped only when the occupying authority stopped it. SCAP Directive No. 2, issued on the 3rd of September, 1945, ordered it halted, and by then it had been running for nearly a month. The Washington Document Center subsequently seized approximately 450,000 items, of which roughly 20,000 were returned. A separate detail, reported by Kyoto and the Japan Times in 2008, concerns the discovery in Britain of Japanese Navy orders directing the destruction of documents and items associated with the emperor after the surrender. Now the methodological point, which is the most important statement in this entire account. Material destroyed in August of 1945 was not random. It was selected. Instructions targeted precisely the highest sensitivity categories: foreign affairs, counterintelligence, ideological surveillance, secret history, which means the surviving record is not a representative sample of what once existed. What survives is the sample that made it through a deliberate filter designed to remove exactly the most incriminating material. Statisticians call this survivorship bias, and the classic illustration involves aircraft returning from bombing raids. Examine the returning planes, map where the bullet holes cluster, and the intuitive conclusion is to armor those areas. The correct conclusion runs the opposite way. Holes in the returning aircraft show where a plane can be hit and still come home, and the areas with no holes are where the aircraft that never returned were struck. The August 1945 record is the returning aircraft. Practical consequences for this subject are precise, and they deserve plain statement. In the case of Emperor Hirohito, the absence of a document ordering something cannot be treated as evidence that no such order was ever given. That does not prove incriminating orders existed. It means the inference is unavailable in both directions permanently. Anyone telling you the record exonerates the Showa emperor is claiming more than the record can support, and anyone telling you the record convicts him is doing exactly the same thing. Between September of 1945 and December of 1948, a version of Emperor Hirohito was constructed for public and legal consumption, and that process is documented. It is the most concrete part of this entire story, and it begins with the photograph. On the 27th of September, 1945, Emperor Hirohito went to the American Embassy in Tokyo to meet General Douglas MacArthur. The image taken that day, the towering American in an open-necked shirt beside the small emperor in formal morning dress, communicated the new order more effectively than any proclamation could have. What was said inside that room is the single most important disputed quotation in modern Japanese history. According to MacArthur, the emperor offered himself for judgment as the one bearing sole responsibility for every political and military decision made and action taken by his people in the conduct of the war. Here is the provenance problem in full. That quotation appears in MacArthur's memoir Reminiscences, published in 1964, on pages 287 and 288, written approximately 19 years after the meeting. 3 people were present: Emperor Hirohito, General MacArthur, and the interpreter Kitsuzo Okamura, and all 3 agreed to keep the contents confidential. The account of that meeting in the Showa Tenno Jitsuroku, the official annals compiled by the Imperial Household Agency and published in 2014, contains no offer to take responsibility. Herbert Bix reads this inside a broader pattern of blame shifting and questions its literal accuracy. The historian Peter Mach argues the opposite, holding that the emperor in all probability did offer to take responsibility, and supports it with corroborating strands. MacArthur made similar statements to the diplomat George Atchison in October of 1945 and to the Far Eastern Commission in January of 1946, long before the memoir appeared. Okamura, the interpreter, is said to have left 2 versions of the record, one of which omits the admission. A Feller's memorandum dated the 2nd of October, 1945, exists. So does Hisanori Fujita's 1961 memoir, in which the responsibility is stated as being entirely the emperor's. The dispute stays unresolved. What can be said with confidence is that the most famous confession in modern Japanese history rests on a chain of testimony containing no contemporaneous, uncontested, first-party record. Whatever was said on the 27th of September, what happened next is documented and deliberate. On the 1st of January, 1946, the emperor issued what became known as the Humanity Declaration, the Ningen Sengen. On the 6th of March, 1946, Brigadier General Bonner Fellers met Admiral Mitsumasa Yanai through the interpreter Shuichi Mizoda. According to the Mizoda memorandum, Fellers told Yanai it would be most convenient if the Japanese side could prove the emperor was completely blameless, and that Tojo in particular should be made to bear all responsibility at the trial. That quotation carries its own provenance note. It rests on the Mizoda memorandum, cited in John Dower's Embracing Defeat, drawing on the research of Kentaro Iwaya. The text stays stable across the secondary literature, though it belongs attributed to that chain rather than treated as an independently verified primary record. 12 days later, the emperor began dictating his own account. Between the 18th of March and the 8th of April, 1946, across 5 sessions, Emperor Hirohito dictated what became known as the Showa Tenno Jitsuroku, the Emperor's Monologue. It runs to 2 volumes, 173 leaves written on rectos only, transcribed by the diplomat Hidenari Terasaki, covering events from the Zhang Zuolin assassination in 1928 through to the surrender broadcast. Its argument stays consistent throughout. Blame rests primarily on Japan's incurably aggressive armed services, and the emperor could not have vetoed the war without risking civil conflict and the destruction of the country. Timing is the point. That document was dictated in March and April of 1946, in the specific context of an approaching war crimes tribunal that opened 5 weeks later. Herbert Bix treats it as a whitewash. Stephen Large finds its core defense, that Hirohito could do nothing to prevent war between the United States and Japan, partly corroborated by the court diaries. Both read its purpose skeptically, and the self-interested context is not a matter of interpretation but a matter of the calendar. A separate English-language version of the monologue, differing from the Japanese, later turned up among the papers of Bonner Fellers, examined by Makoto Higashino in a 1998 study of the 2 monologues. The document itself was published in Japan by Bunjei Shuinju in 1990, causing a national sensation. On the 6th of December, 2017, it sold at Bonhams in New York for $275,000, nearly triple its pre-sale estimate of $100,000 to $150,000, to the plastic surgeon Kitsuya Takasu. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East sat from the 3rd of May, 1946, to the 12th of November, 1948, with Sir William Webb presiding and Joseph Keenan serving as chief prosecutor. Numbers around the prosecution deserve precise statement, because the funnel is where the story lives. Class A war crimes. Suspects detained or under investigation at Sugamo prison number roughly 80 to 100 depending on the source, with Umatadani giving approximately 100 awaiting investigation in December of 1945 and other accounts giving 80 detained, a discrepancy that reflects arrests occurring in waves rather than a contradiction. 28 were indicted. According to Keenan's letter of the 16th of July, 1948, preserved in the American diplomatic record, 27 of those 28 had been among the original suspects, with Osami Nagano added later. Of the 28, Shumi Okawa was removed on grounds of mental fitness, while Yosuke Matsuoka and Osami Nagano died during the proceedings. Verdicts came down between the 4th and 12th of November, 1948. 7 received death sentences, 16 received life imprisonment, and 2 received lesser terms. Then came the moment the strategy nearly failed. On the 31st of December, 1947, Hideki Tojo testified that no Japanese subject would act against the emperor's will. It was the truth, and it was catastrophic, because it placed ultimate authority exactly where the entire prosecution strategy had been arranged to avoid placing it. What followed is documented in Dower's work. Chief Prosecutor Keenan, working through the emperor's own advisors, arranged for Koichi Kido to be contacted in prison so that Tojo could be induced to revise his statement. Tojo recanted. Consider the structure of that transaction. The chief prosecutor of an international war crimes tribunal coordinated with the defense, through the imperial court, to alter testimony implicating the head of state. This is not a uniquely Japanese phenomenon, and recognizing the general pattern makes it easier to see clearly. Large-scale legal exposure gets managed routinely through a technique that might be called liability containment. When an institution faces prosecution that could destroy it, the strategy is never to contest every charge. The strategy is to construct a boundary, identifying individuals whose culpability will be conceded fully, so that the concession terminates the inquiry before it reaches the structures that must survive. Modern corporate settlements work this way, with named executives absorbing liability while the institution continues. 3 things make the technique work. Cooperative defendants, a prosecutor with an interest in a bounded outcome, and a story in which the contained individuals appear to be the actual authors of what occurred. By 1948, all 3 existed in Tokyo. Tojo and 6 others were executed on the 23rd of December, 1948. The following day, the 24th of December, the 19 remaining Class A suspects were released without charge. Earlier batches had gone free in August of 1947 and February of 1948, and among those released in December of 1948 was Nobisuke Kishi, who would later become Prime Minister of Japan. All of that material supports what John Dower argued in Embracing Defeat, published in 1999. Dower's thesis holds that the innocent, pacifist emperor was deliberately constructed as an instrument of the occupation. MacArthur's staff, and Fellers in particular, built a barrier between the throne and the men in the dock. Defendants coordinated their testimony. The emperor was never called to account. Dower argues further that this arrangement shaped Japan's incomplete reckoning with the war for the next half-century, because a reckoning that begins by exempting the apex of the system cannot follow the chain of responsibility to its end. Note carefully what Dower's argument does and does not establish. It establishes that the exoneration was engineered. It does not, by itself, establish what the emperor would have been found to have done had the engineering never occurred. Those are separate questions, and conflating them is the most common error made about this subject. When a historical question is contested, the temptation is to assume one side carries political motivation and the other does not. On the subject of Emperor Hirohito, that assumption is wrong. The disagreement runs between serious scholars working from the same archives, and it has not narrowed much across 25 years. Herbert Bix's Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan, published in 2000 and winner of the Pulitzer Prize in 2001, remains the most influential English-language statement of the case for imperial responsibility. Bix's thesis is direct. Emperor Hirohito operated as an active, informed, politically engaged monarch who shaped strategy and bears direct moral, political, and legal responsibility. And the image of a passive figurehead was never a historical finding, but a post-war fabrication produced jointly by American and Japanese interests. Bix advances a secondary thesis that does a great deal of work inside his argument, namely that the emperor's overriding motive throughout was preservation of the throne with himself on it. That single premise explains the 1929 intervention, the accommodation of Manchuria, the ferocity of February 1936, the timing of the Sidon, and the post-war self-presentation as one continuous strategy rather than a series of inconsistencies. What Bix built the book on deserves mention. It draws on roughly 50 years of Japanese scholarship, with approximately 95% of its sources in Japanese, so the characterization sometimes offered, that it represents an outsider's polemic, does not survive contact with its bibliography. Peter Wetzler's Hirohito and War, published in 1998, is the position most often set against Bix, and here a correction becomes necessary, because Wetzler's argument gets widely misrepresented as an innocence thesis. It is nothing of the kind. Wetzler emphasizes consensus decision-making, the Japanese processes of nemawashi and ringi, in which agreement gets built incrementally from below before any formal decision is taken, and he warns against imposing Western models of individual executive agency onto a system that never worked that way. Wetzler's conclusion, though, is that Emperor Hirohito did know of and did participate in military planning, including advanced knowledge of the Pearl Harbor operation, and that this participation stayed consistent with his belief in the imperial tradition, the Kokutai. So the actual disagreement between Bix and Wetzler is not whether the emperor knew. Both conclude he knew. Where they part company is over what informed participation inside a consensus structure amounts to, morally and legally, which is a far narrower and far more interesting argument than the one usually reported. Stephen Large's political biography, published in 1992, occupies a middle position. Large treats the monologue as partly opportunistic special pleading, while finding its central defensive claim that Hirohito could do nothing to prevent war between the United States and Japan, partly corroborated by the court diaries. That is a constrained agency reading. Real limits, real knowledge, limited room. Noriko Kawamura's Emperor Hirohito and the Pacific War, published in 2015, poses the question this account has already circled. If the emperor could not stop the war in 1941, how was he able to end it in 1945 through the Sidon? Kawamura's answer paints a portrait of ambivalence. The emperor she describes is conflicted, juggling irreconcilable advice from advisors who could not agree, neither a pacifist nor a supporter of the military's reckless wars. On her account, his reservations delayed the Pearl Harbor operation. Kawamura also keeps open the possibility of symbolic responsibility even under a reading where the emperor's power was largely symbolic, a distinction most popular treatments never bothered to make. The conservative Japanese position, associated with Ikehiko Hato, whose study appeared in English translation in 2007, holds that Hirohito operated as a constitutional monarch bound by convention, and that his interventions, February 1936 and the Sidon, registered as exceptional and constitutionally anomalous precisely because the norm was non-intervention. Against that stands the Japanese progressive scholarship of Kentaro Iwaya, Akira Yamada, and Yoshiaki Yoshimi, focused on documented imperial sanction of specific atrocities through imperial general headquarters, with the chemical warfare material being the clearest instance. Iwaya's research also underpins much of what is known about the post-war engineering of exoneration. Running underneath all of these positions is a distinction that deserves stating on its own, because a great deal of confusion dissolves once someone makes it. Legal responsibility and moral or political responsibility are not the same thing. Many scholars who doubt that Emperor Hirohito bore legal culpability, given the constitutional structure, the consensus machinery, and the political decision not to indict, nonetheless argue that he bore moral and political responsibility. The historian Yukio Ito has argued that Hirohito himself felt moral responsibility while never accepting political responsibility. A person can be legally shielded, structurally constrained, and morally implicated all at once. Most public argument about this subject collapses those three into one and then argues past itself, which brings the argument to the largest documentary event in this field, and to a dispute that reveals how contested the subject remains. On the 9th of September, 2014, the Imperial Household Agency released the Showa Tenno Jitsuroku, the Annals of Emperor Showa. The project had begun in 1990 and taken roughly 24 years, and the result runs to 61 volumes, 60 of main text plus an index and notes volume, totaling approximately 12,000 pages. According to Herbert Bix, writing in the Asia-Pacific Journal in 2015, the compilers assembled a trove of 3,152 primary materials, including unpublished and previously unknown diaries of military and civil officials, arranged chronologically, with roughly 40 of those materials having been unknown before. Commercial publication by Tokyo Shoseki began in March of 2015 and continued through to 2018 and 2019. Reception is where it becomes instructive, because the Jitsuroku drew criticism from both directions at once. The liberal Mainichi editorialized that it hardly contained anything reversing conventional wisdom, and the critique from that side, articulated by Bix among others, holds that the compilation is premised on the assumption it was supposed to test, that the emperor was a non-political constitutional monarch, and so never engages the hard questions. The conservative Yomiuri criticized it for a different omission, the absence of the emperor's own words regarding Yasukuni Shrine. Two specific absences deserve naming. The Jitsuroku does not include the emperor's offer of responsibility at the MacArthur meeting, and it does not include the text of the Yasukuni memo. Takashi Hara published a full critical reading of the Annals in 2015. 12,000 pages, 3,152 sources, 24 years of compilation by the institution, holding the most complete access to the imperial record, and both ends of the Japanese political spectrum concluded the material that mattered most was missing. That outcome is not a scandal. It is what happens when an institution documents itself. What it does mean is that the largest documentary release on this subject never closed the question and was never really structured to. Emperor Hirohito lived for 43 years after the surrender, and what he said across that time, alongside what he pointedly declined to say, forms the last body of evidence. In 1971, the Showa emperor toured Europe, and the tour drew protests in Britain and in the Netherlands, organized by former prisoners of war and by people from territories Japan had occupied. 26 years after the war, the man who had reigned over it was met in European capitals by the people who had survived it. Between the 30th of September and the 14th of October, 1975, Emperor Hirohito visited the United States, the first visit to America by a Japanese emperor, and during that period he gave his first domestic press conference. Two answers from it have been argued over ever since. Asked about the atomic bombings, the emperor called it very regrettable that nuclear bombs had been dropped, and said he felt sorry for the citizens of Hiroshima, but that it could not be helped, because it happened in wartime. The phrase rendered as "it could not be helped" is shikata ga nai, and the translation is a genuine and long-standing controversy. In English it reads as callous dismissal. In Japanese it also carries a register of fatalistic resignation, closer to nothing could be done about it. Which of those the emperor intended is not recoverable from the phrase alone. An English-language reaction to the remark was shaped by the harsher rendering. Asked about his own war responsibility, the emperor deflected, saying he could not answer such a question because he had not studied literature well enough. Exact wording of that answer needs verification against the original transcript before quotation, though the evasion itself faces no doubt at all. In 1978, 14 Class A war criminals were secretly enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine, and Emperor Hirohito never visited the shrine again. For 28 years the reason stayed a matter of speculation. Then, on the 20th of July, 2006, the Nihon Keizai Shimbun published a memo recorded by the Grand Steward Tomohiko Tomita, dating from April of 1988. In it, the emperor states that after the enshrinement he never worshipped there again, that it was his conscience, and that this was why he had not visited since. Authenticity of the memo is widely accepted, including by Akihiko Hato, a scholar from the conservative side of the argument. It remains a third-party record rather than the emperor's own writing, and that qualification belongs with it. On the 7th of December, 1988, with the emperor gravely ill, the mayor of Nagasaki, Hitoshi Motoshima, told his city assembly that he believed the emperor bore responsibility for the war. On the 18th of January, 1990, Motoshima was shot in the back. His attacker, Kazumi Wakashima, belonged to a far-right group called Saikajuku and received 12 years for attempted murder. That period, running from the final illness through to the death, is remembered in Japan as a time of jishuku, self-restraint. Festivals were canceled, public gaiety was suppressed nationwide, and the country held its breath. Emperor Hirohito died on the 7th of January, 1989, at the age of 87. Then, decades later, the private records began surfacing. In 2018, the diary of Shinobu Kobayashi, the emperor's last chamberlain, was revealed. An entry dated the 7th of April, 1987, 21 months before his death, records the emperor saying he had been told about his war responsibility and that he saw no point in living longer because it would only increase his chances of seeing or hearing things that were agonizing. In August of 2019, the broadcaster NHK released the papers of Michiji Taijima, a Grand Steward, comprising 18 notebooks recording dialogue between 1949 and 1953. They show that in 1952, at the moment Japan regained its independence, Emperor Hirohito wanted to include the word remorse in his speech, saying that no matter what, he really thought he needed to include the word remorse. Blocking it fell to Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, who objected on the grounds that there was a danger people would say he had been responsible for starting the war. The historian Takahisa Furukawa, commenting on the Kobayashi diary, observed that it shows a man who took responsibility for the war gravely and for a long time, and that the feeling grew stronger as he aged. The historian Carol Gluck offered the more measured assessment that the new documents add to but do not change the historical portrait, and that what they reveal is an individual rather than an institution. Both of those readings sit compatibly with the evidence. Neither of them tells us what the emperor knew in December of 1937 or what he understood himself to be authorizing in the autumn of 1938. Almost everything examined so far is an argument conducted inside Japanese and American sources about a Japanese constitutional question. That is not the only frame, and for most of the people affected, it was never the relevant one. The war was waged in the emperor's name. Colonial subjects in Korea and Taiwan were mobilized in the emperor's name. Occupation administrations across the Philippines and Southeast Asia governed in the emperor's name. From the perspective of those populations, a debate over whether the man whose name appeared on the orders was constitutionally entitled to refuse them addresses a question that was never the important one. Scale is where the frame diverges most obviously, and the divergence is not simply political. Chinese official memory periodizes the war differently. Beginning in 1931 at Mukden, the 14-Year War, not 1937, and certainly not 1941. According to a State Council Information Office briefing reported on the 15th of July, 2015, drawing on a Party History Research Center survey launched in October of 2004 involving approximately 600,000 participants, China suffered more than 35 million military and non-military casualties across the 14 years, with military casualties totaling 3.8 million. Western academic estimates of Chinese deaths commonly land between 10 and 20 million, with midpoints frequently near 14 million. For the Second Sino-Japanese War specifically, compiled figures include Chinese nationalist official data of roughly 1.32 million killed, Western estimates of more than 2 million Chinese military killed, total Chinese military casualties around 3.85 million, and Japanese military dead between 455,700 and 700,000 based on Japanese medical data. Separately, R. J. Rummel's work on democide estimates that the Japanese regime murdered between 3 million and more than 10 million people between 1937 and 1945, most probably around 6 million, with China calculated separately. Those numbers do not reconcile, and the reasons they do not reconcile are specific. The start date comes first, because counting from 1931, 1937, or 1941 produces 3 different wars. The word casualties comes second. In the Chinese official framing, 35 million casualties means killed and wounded combined, while Western estimates of 10 to 20 million refer to deaths. So comparing one against the other is a category error, and it gets made constantly. Inclusion comes third. Whether colonial subjects, Koreans and Taiwanese, get counted as Japanese, as victims, or not at all, moves totals by millions, and so does whether indirect deaths from famine, disease, and displacement are counted alongside deaths by violence. Incentives come forth, because the scale of suffering carries political weight, and every government involved understands that. None of this renders the numbers unknowable. It renders them incomparable unless the definitions travel alongside them. One further dimension intersects directly with imperial responsibility. The system of military so-called comfort stations, documented from the 1990s onward by Yoshiaki Yoshimi, the same historian whose work established the Wuhan gas authorizations, with estimates reaching up to approximately 200,000 women. The redress movement that grew out of that documentation has consistently rejected the constitutional innocence framing, on the grounds that the state apparatus, the atrocities, and the colonial subjugation were all conducted under a single authority, and that authority had a name. Textbook controversies within Japan over how imperial responsibility and wartime atrocities get depicted have continued without resolution. Return now to where this began. In November of 1948, 7 men were sentenced to hang, and the question of in whose name they had acted went unasked by the tribunal that sentenced them, because the answer had been arranged in advance. Through Fellers and Yanai in March of 1946, through the monologue dictated that same month, through the coordination that walked back Tojo's testimony in December of 1947. What can be established is genuinely broad. Emperor Hirohito sat at the apex of a command structure in which the Army and Navy reported directly to him, bypassing the cabinet entirely. July of 1929 demonstrated that his displeasure could end a government. February of 1936 demonstrated that he could override the Army High Command when he chose to. September of 1941 found him questioning Sugiyama with enough precision to show he tracked the Army's failed promises. Peter Wetzler, working from the consensus model, concludes he held advanced knowledge of the Pearl Harbor operation. Yoshiaki Yoshimi and Seiya Matsuno document 375 gas authorizations moving through Imperial General Headquarters during the Battle of Wuhan. In February of 1945, he was told the war was lost, and answered that peace required one more military gain. In August of 1945, he broke a deadlock the system could not break twice. What cannot be established runs equally broad. Whether the poem recited on the 6th of September, 1941, was a plea or a ritual. What was reported to the throne from Nanjing in December of 1937, and in what terms? What the emperor understood himself to be sanctioning on any given day at Wuhan. Whether the cite-in were sovereign acts or instruments wielded by the men who arranged the deadlock. Whether he said what MacArthur claimed he said on the 27th of September, 1945. Some of that stays unknowable, because human intention is not recoverable from documents. A considerable portion of it stays unknowable for a far more specific reason, which is that between the 7th and the 20th of August, 1945, under written orders that included instructions to destroy the orders themselves, the Japanese state burned the categories of record most likely to answer it. Foreign affairs, counterintelligence, ideological surveillance, secret history. Herbert Bix, Peter Wetzler, Stephen Large, Noriko Kawamura, Ikehiko Hato, Kintaro Awaya, John Dower. 7 serious scholars, 4 decades of work, 1 archive, and no convergence. That is not a failure of scholarship. It is what an incomplete evidentiary record produces when the incompleteness was engineered by the people with the most to lose. In 1952, Emperor Hirohito wanted to say the word remorse in a public speech, and was told that saying it would suggest he had been responsible for starting the war. In 1987, he told a chamberlain he saw no reason to keep living, because living meant hearing more about his war responsibility. In 1988, he explained privately why he had stopped visiting a shrine. In 1975, asked directly and in public, he said he had not studied literature well enough to answer. 62 years on the throne, and the only places the Showa emperor ever came close to answering the question were rooms where nobody could hold him to it. The evidence that would have settled it went into a fire in August of 1945, on the instruction of men who understood exactly what they were protecting, and the question they burned it to prevent has outlived every one of them.